I actually just got back from China, where I spent a week. It was sort of super nerd Cusp in that it was a bunch of scientists from China, from the United States, from many disciplines to kind of just get together and talk about what are some of the big things happening in science right now. I spent a lot of time with astronomers and planetary scientists, and their discussions of black holes and physics and space exploration and the interconnections between time and space really inspired me, because in many ways they are asking the same kinds of questions that I ask. How do we get here? Who are we? What are we made of? How are we shaped by the environment? And how, in return, do we shape the environment ourselves? And how are we connected in the past and into the future? And really interesting to me, how do time and space simultaneously converge and diverge? So there are many ways to approach these existential questions. I'm a biological anthropologist, and so the anthropologist in me loved that sort of cultural history of the object, the material culture of sex toys. And I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I come to those existential questions through the study of the human body via the process of pregnancy. I had those tasteful little stars, although I saw it was completely unnecessary to do so. So pregnancy, fetal development, childbirth, these have occupied the mind of artists and scientists and philosophers for millennia, perhaps ever since we as a species were even aware of our bodies as a distinct component of our existence. We know that a baby needs a healthy womb to develop optimally, but do we really know, we as a group in this room, do we really know how the womb does that? How does that kind of watery aquatic world of the fetus work? So to really dissect those questions, I need you to trust me on this, we need to turn to the placenta. Perhaps not something you thought you would be learning about today. What is the placenta? Where does it come from? I have lots of questions. I don't have all the answers, but I have lots of questions. What does it do? Other than just being kind of gross, because it sort of is gross as well as absolutely beautiful and fascinating. So you can see in some of these images that the placenta is cast in some role in the story of intrauterine development and birth. The ancient Egyptians believed that the placenta was the seat of the soul and linked with health and prosperity throughout the life course. So there's a connection between one's postnatal life and their placenta. This can be seen here in this procession of the pharaoh with attendants, one of whom is carrying the royal placenta. And even in recent times, in some parts of Egypt, the placenta is considered the second child. And in fact, across many cultures, there is a sort of sibling relationship, the spiritual connection with a lost sibling between the individual and their placenta. In the Visayan region of the Philippines, where I work, this is one characterization of the many different traditions for burying the placenta and what it means. The tendency of a child when grown to travel is influenced by the manner his placenta, or inunlan in Tagalog, which means the baby's pillow, is disposed. If it is buried in the ground near the midmost post of the house, the child will be a stay-at-home. If it is buried at the foot of the stairs, the child will always return home, though he travels far. And if it is thrown into the sea, the child will travel far and wide. So there's this connection that has been long recognized between this very central part of our intrauterine experience and who we become, who we are as adults. I don't know if this is reassuring in any way, but that's actually a delicious cake decorated to look like a yummy placenta. That's preparation for a picture that's coming later. So I just, which is actually less gross than this one, oddly enough. So what is the placenta? Do we even really know what it is? It comes from the same ball of cells that we come from. It comes from that fertilized egg. The cells differentiate really early after fertilization. You get something that looks like a little racquetball with a wad of gum stuck in the center. That wad of gum becomes us. The wall of the ball becomes the placenta. Those cells are really tasked with making landfall in the uterus, with establishing the mooring between fetus and mother. And this is happening before the embryo itself is really doing much of anything. And so what this means, and I want you to really pay attention because this might be the coolest thing that I'm going to tell you, is that the embryo that doesn't even exist yet designs its own environment by producing its own placenta. Rad, I know. So internally, the human placenta is essentially a forest of trees with the branches kind of blowing in the breeze of maternal blood, the branches here outlined in green. They're absorbing gases, hormones, amino acids from maternal blood, delivering them to the baby to build the baby, expelling wastes back into maternal blood, and sending chemical signals to the maternal brain. So the placenta actually sort of speaks for the fetus. It communicates through hormonal signaling to the maternal brain and other tissues. Here I am sciencing. Under the microscope, we can see how intimate and delicate this relationship is. So these purple clumps of tissue are those branches blowing in the breeze of this white space that would be filled with maternal blood. Over here, at very high magnification, is the very tip of one of those. And you can see this is a fetal capillary. This is where maternal blood would be. And this is blown up huge. So we're talking about something that's just a few cell layers thick, finer than a human hair, separating two distinct individuals. So the placenta is the very first thing we make. It is form and function incarnate. But why do we care? Why am I talking to you about the placenta? What does it have to do with moving us through time and space? I actually kind of have an answer to that one, but it's a pretty awesome question. So to understand this, I want to introduce some concepts to illustrate these sort of permeable boundaries separating biological individuals from each other and from each stage of life. So I'm going to talk about genetic complexity. Don't zone out, there's not a lot of biology in there. Experiential connectivity and placental synchronicity. So the take home here is that the womb a female provides her fetus is rooted in the womb she herself experienced as a fetus. Each of us is a product of our mother and father's genes. In turn, they are a product of their parents' genes, which in turn is a product of their parents' genes. And I think you can see where this goes. As individuals, we are constructed of molecules that have been cycling through thousands and thousands of generations, linking our biological individuality in the now to processes in the very deep past. But we are more than our genes. Genes get switched off and on constantly. All the DNA in our bodies and all the cells is essentially identical, but some get turned on. Some get turned off. So that's why you have a brain cell and a skin cell and a muscle cell, and they're all different and they all do different things. They're differentiated, but the DNA, the molecule itself, is actually the same. But even more subtly, gene expression can be affected by our environment in the now, in the lived experience. Molecules attach to the DNA, which sort of locks it down, so it's inexpressible, can't get turned on. This phenomenon is called epigenetics. Epi, above, beyond, something beyond just the molecules themselves. How are the molecules regulated? We know from a variety of experiments and observations in humans and other animals that the lived experience of an organism can have enormous impacts on how the genes are regulated. We also know that some of these molecular locks can be inherited along with the DNA itself. So for example, some genes in the stress pathway of maternal, fetal, and placental tissues are regulated differently in people who have experienced poor nutrition, poor rearing behavior. And when I say people for the rearing behavior, that was actually in rats. So biology, we use people really broadly. But in human studies, and I think this is, thinking about being social and looking out for each other and thinking about society and how we affect individual lived experience. People experience high levels of psychosocial stress, institutional racism, discrimination, and recently a study came out, the experience of war in the Congo changes that composition of those molecular locks, changes the way the genes are expressed. So the body and its response to the environment is designed not only by the biology, but also through experience. Even our mother's experience when we are in the womb, and the way a pregnant woman experiences that world is translated to her fetus in the form not only of her own gene expression and how her body's working, but also through alterations in fetal gene expression. This is an important concept to understand what I mean by experiential connectivity. We have a very complicated maternal ecology. We are organisms existing in a maternal ecology as fetuses. So there are many arrows pointing in many different directions, and many of them could have more arrows drawn between them. But here's just a sampling. So on your right, you see sort of traditional biological inputs to a pregnancy. So conditions during pregnancy, like her nutrition, her genome, her epigenome, how her genome is regulated, and her developmental experience, how she grew, her growth and development up until that point. But that's really nested within her lived experience, her immediate lived experience, like, is she food secure or food insecure? Does she have access to health care throughout her entire life and during the pregnancy? And that's really dictated by forces far beyond the realm of individual responsibility. We're talking about political, economic forces, forces beyond one's own control. What is her socio-behavioral setting? Who is she surrounded with? What kind of relationships? Is she in a situation where there's a lot of abuse, withholding of affection, withholding of resources? Those are things that shape the ecology that a fetus develops in. This experience as a fetus leads to a birth outcome. The most established one is birth weight, low birth weight, high birth weight, and then also the growth and regulation of the HPA, which is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal glands, or the stress pathway, or the HPG, hypothalamus pituitary gonads, so sort of the reproductive pathway, and organogenesis, just the way the different organ systems develop, grow and develop, that's shaped by this intrauterine environment, which in turn has an impact on how we live our lives as adults, how our bodies are equipped to handle the world that we live in. We know that there are links between these early life conditions, these birth outcomes, and adult health, like cardiovascular and metabolic health, and reproductive health. And reproductive health is particularly important because once you're talking about reproduction, what are you talking about? The next generation, the next cycle, the next several loopings of the cycle, and also thinking backwards through the cycle of how we got to one pregnancy, how we had an outcome, and how it moves us forward. So this means that the womb a female provides to her fetus is in large, but some mysterious part due to the womb she herself experienced as a fetus, or what I have coined the womb-to-womb view of the life course. So for example, we can see these birth outcomes like prematurity, low birth weight. We know they have an impact on immediate health and survival of the infants, but what we've come to understand in the last 30 years is that they also have an impact on how we live our lives as adults. So in particular, there's a lot of research linking low birth weight with impaired cardiovascular health, metabolic health. In part, the most protected system during fetal development is the brain. The brain is central to all other body systems, and so it's called brain sparing. The body will do what it can to get resources to the brain. So that means if there's a shortage somewhere or an impairment somewhere, most likely other organ systems will be impaired first before the brain. That doesn't mean that the brain can always escape this. So we have found links between poor birth outcomes and obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, but also things like cognitive deficits and mental illness in adults. Now, thinking as an evolutionary biologist, which means I'm always wondering how biological change over long periods might come about, I wondered whether there was a link between these birth outcomes and reproductive health. Change happens across generations, which is essentially the core goal of reproduction and central to evolutionary change. So, obligatory picture of adorable monkeys. I work with these guys, specifically the common marmoset. These are a couple of infants here and here. The whole marmoset and tamarin family is just ridiculously cute, but they offer some really interesting reproductive biology for somebody like me. They produce litters as opposed to singletons. We produce just one baby, they produce multiple ones. So they offer this natural variation, sort of a natural experiment in nutrient restriction, because you add another baby in there, things get a little tight. So we can sort of ask some questions about that. And we know from some of our other work with this team that has been working with these monkeys for decades. So we know from our work with the marmosets that the triplets have lower birth weights, they have higher perinatal mortality than twins do, so that they have some aspects of impaired birth condition. Their placentas also show marked reductions in surface area available for nutrient transport, so we'd see a difference in their placentas as well. So we wanted to know if, as adults, female triplets differed from twins in terms of the reproductive success. Did the womb the fetus develop in have an effect on the womb they themselves went on to develop? So to answer that question, we asked if triplets, once they're adults, did they have sort of the same reproductive success as the twins did? So we start with twins and triplets, they grow up, we look at their reproductive output, and particularly pregnancy loss. Were they carrying babies to term as adults? And the answer is no. They're getting pregnant as much as the twins are. They're ovulating, they're getting pregnant, they are carrying the same number of fetuses, but triplets are losing those fetuses to miscarriage and abortion at 3 times the rate that the twins are. And in multiple models, that was the best predictor, her litter size at birth. We are very thankful to the National Institutes of Health, if any of you are out there, for giving us lots of money to try to find out what the mechanisms are. But what is clear is that something about this earliest of environments leaves a lasting mark on the design of the reproductive system, and this has great implications for the health of ensuing generations. And what does this mean? Why am I telling you about monkeys? Well, in humans, a large percentage of stillbirth is not known. We don't know why stillbirth happens in most cases. Most models focus on current health. They focus on, are you a smoker? Are you overweight? Are you black? Are you Hispanic? The sort of demographic characteristics, which are actually kind of interesting, because some of those are risk factors. And what we know is that global stillbirth rates map onto poverty and low birth weight. So worldwide, you see the highest stillbirth rates in Southeast Asia and Africa, in the United States, in the poorest regions of the country, you see high rates of stillbirth, which is the exact same map you see for low birth weight, suggesting they might be linked in some important way that we need to figure out. Placental synchronicity underlies some of this, or at least we think. So in addition to marmosets, I do work with another primate species, our own. So I work in the Philippines, where a group of women have been studied since their mothers were pregnant with them in 1983. So the women in my study, we have been studying since they were 3rd trimester fetuses, which, if any of you understand working with human populations, that is an extraordinary cohort. That just doesn't happen, so we're very lucky. It might not surprise you to know I'm really into their placentas, and they have graciously give them to me. So far, we've collected dozens of placentas from recent pregnancies, from those now 30-year-old women, to explore links between their own birth outcomes 30 years ago and the structure and function of their babies' placentas now. You still with me? But I want to pause here to talk about the small scale of really hugely important things. I mentioned earlier that barrier between mother and fetus was less than the diameter of a hair. So this might put that in perspective. So the big blue circle is a human hair. This tiny little dot is a micron. So what I'm talking about is something that's about 7 microns thick. It's very small, but turns out to be hugely important. Because when we factored in all kinds of predictor variables, all the usual suspects, we found that the single best predictor of that membrane, which is the membrane across which hormones, amino acids, gases, all of the building blocks for that baby pass across that membrane. So the best predictor of how thick that membrane would be was the mother's own birth weight 30 years ago, meaning that something about the mother's own intrauterine experience is being communicated to her fetus by the placenta. Some mysterious message that we haven't yet deciphered, but we are very hopeful that the kind people at the National Institutes of Health will give us money to help figure this out. But this is extraordinary, this kind of finding, and it's the first of its kind, and we're really excited about the direction this is leading us. Because it's clear that the placenta is our best candidate for understanding how this complex historical ecology shapes birth outcomes and future outcomes. Womb to womb, yeah, okay. So what I'm describing here, what I'm proposing, is really a borderless state of biological existence. We're genetically complex, experientially connected through placental synchronization with past maternal ecologies. So how can we visualize this? Craft time. My assistant, my 3-year-old daughter, Adelaide, was not available during the making of this project. She had other engagements. So you'll have to forgive the lack of glitter. So people like me like to talk about health and lived experience in terms of, in terms of the life course, which is sort of like a timeline, right? The Lifeline, where we have, a baby on one end, and we grow up into an adult. Okay? This is sort of how we visualize life, along a line, along a single continuum. But I think I've established here that maybe this is not fully complex enough to really adequately capture movement through time and space, back to previous generations, moving forward, looking at our effect on future generations. Now, this long view does take a multidisciplinary approach, theoretically, methodologically, but it is still linear and static. So we could make it a loop. That's more complex, right? It captures a little more movement, but it's still kind of linear. But I think what work like mine and other scientists is showing is that the design of the fetus is deeply embedded within complex processes that predate the fetus and sort of postdate the adult. The environment is a temporal and spatial aggregate of genes and experience, okay? And it's built upon many generations. So we need to have something that captures that complexity. So with a simple conceptual twist, I suggest that our biological experience is much more like this Mobius strip, where all of a sudden we have time and space still connected, but also decoupled at times, but joining back up in endless directions on an endless plane of existence. We are all designed by genes and experienced via the crucible of the placenta, looking both backward and forward. Told you. Now, in much the same way that the starlight we see today is a palimpsest of the past, of energy released millions and millions of years ago that we are now just seeing, so does the placenta contain the mysteries of the past and predictions for the future, and that exploration has just begun. Thank you.